The photograph was small, no larger than a man's palm, its edges softened by time and handling, the surface cracked with fine, white veins, like the skin of something long dead. It showed a family seated on a grassy hill, beneath an open sky. Their clothes stiff and formal, despite the informality of the setting, as if leisure itself were an unfamiliar ritual. Light spilled gently across the frame, giving everything the calm assurance of a summer afternoon that expected nothing more from the world than to be remembered kindly. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. The mother sat upright on a checkered blanket, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression fixed in the practiced neutrality common to early photographs. Two children sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, their faces pale ovals with eyes too dark to read clearly. Behind them, the landscape rolled away into soft focus, trees dissolving into shadow, the horizon blurred as though the earth itself had exhaled. The father sat slightly apart. He was positioned at the edge of the blanket, one knee raised, his body angled not toward the camera, but toward something just beyond it. His face carried the faint suggestion of a smile, though it failed to reach his eyes. Those eyes were alert, strained, fixed on a point below the frame. His right hand disappeared beneath the blanket, the fabric pulled tight around his wrist, creased sharply as if wrapped around an object that resisted being held. The longer one looked, the more the stillness of the image began to feel rehearsed. The children's feet were blurred, not enough to suggest movement, but enough to imply they had not been entirely still. The grass near the father's knee lay flattened in a pattern that did not match the rest of the field. Even the light seemed uneven, brighter around the mother and dimmer near him, as though something there absorbed it. On the back of the photograph, written in careful ink that had faded to brown, were only 4 words, "A pleasant afternoon together." There was no date, no names, and yet, the moment the image was held too long, an unshakable certainty emerged. Not that the photograph captured a memory, but that it had captured a decision, one already made, waiting patiently inside the paper for someone, someday, to notice what the father had refused to let go. The photograph surfaced quietly, without ceremony, folded among brittle letters and tax receipts inside a cedar box that had not been opened in decades. It was discovered during the sorting of an estate, the kind of task that turns a life into objects and forces strangers to decide what matters and what does not. At first, the image appeared no different from hundreds of others, taken during the early years of photography, when families posed stiffly and smiles were rationed by long exposure times. The paper had yellowed, its corners softened. The surface cracked in delicate lines that caught the light like frost on glass, giving the impression that the image itself was slowly unraveling. The scene it captured was deceptively calm. A picnic, clearly intentional, arranged with care rather than spontaneity. A patterned blanket lay across the grass, weighed down at the corners, suggesting a breeze that never quite reached the figures seated upon it. The clothing dated the image to the early 20th century: high collars, heavy fabrics, hats resting neatly nearby. Everything spoke of effort, of a moment prepared rather than stumbled upon. The family's posture reflected the customs of the era, each person positioned with restraint, as if leisure were something to be documented rather than enjoyed. What made the photograph linger in the mind was its ordinariness. There was no obvious distortion, no immediate horror, nothing that demanded alarm. The faces were serious but not distressed, composed in the familiar way of people who had been told to hold still and obey the camera. The countryside behind them stretched gently outward, fields and trees fading into the limitations of early lenses. Light fell evenly across the scene, lending it a softness that suggested warmth, perhaps even contentment. And yet, something about the image resisted being dismissed as a simple family memento. The longer it was observed, the more it felt curated, as though the photograph were less a record of an afternoon and more an attempt to preserve an idea of normalcy. The picnic itself seemed symbolic, a deliberate gesture of domestic peace captured at a time when photographs were rare and meaningful, chosen carefully to represent how one wished to be remembered. There was a quiet insistence in the way the family had been arranged, a sense that this moment mattered far more than it should have. No identifying marks accompanied the image. No studio stamp, no handwritten date, no names recorded along the border, which was unusual for the time. Families often annotated their photographs, anchoring them to memory, but this one had been left unclaimed, anonymous, as if its creators expected the image to speak for itself. The absence of context made the photograph feel unmoored, detached from history while simultaneously burdened by it. It was only when the photograph was removed from its box and held in steady light that its calm began to feel deliberate, almost defensive, as though the image were insisting on its own innocence too strongly, asking to be believed before anyone thought to question what exactly was being remembered. Attention shifted almost unintentionally toward the father, not because he dominated the frame, but because something about him resisted the ease granted to the others. His placement was slightly off, his body angled away from the center of the picnic as though he had arrived late or was prepared to leave before the moment had fully settled. While the mother and children appeared arranged for the camera, his posture suggested interruption, a pause taken rather than a pose chosen. This subtle imbalance introduced a tension that did not announce itself immediately, but grew stronger with repeated observation. His right arm vanished beneath the edge of the blanket, a detail easy to overlook at first, dismissed as a trick of shadow or fabric. Yet the blanket itself told a different story. It was pulled taut near his knee, the pattern stretched unnaturally, as if caught around something solid. The folds did not fall with the relaxed irregularity seen elsewhere in the cloth. Instead, they converged, tight and directional, pointing toward his concealed hand. It was the kind of detail that once noticed refused to recede, drawing the eye back again and again. The tension in his wrist was unmistakable. Early photography captured stillness, but it also preserved strain, and the faint blur around his fingers suggested effort rather than rest. His knuckles pressed upward against the fabric, distorting it slightly, implying a grip maintained with intention. This was not the relaxed hand of a man enjoying an afternoon outdoors. It was the hand of someone holding fast, aware that loosening his grasp would alter something beyond the photograph's frame. His expression deepened the unease. While his mouth hinted at a polite smile, his eyes were fixed downward, not toward the camera, but toward whatever lay hidden beneath the blanket. They carried an alertness that felt out of place in such a setting, as though his attention was divided between the act of being photographed and the responsibility of keeping something contained. There was no softness in his gaze, no distraction. It was watchful, guarded, and intent. The rest of the family seemed curiously disconnected from him. The mother's posture remained rigidly composed, her gaze directed forward, while the children sat close together, their faces turned outward, but their bodies angled slightly away from their father. This subtle physical separation suggested an unspoken agreement, a shared understanding that whatever occupied his attention was not to be acknowledged openly. The picnic, in this context, felt less like a gathering and more like a performance, carefully maintained for the duration of the exposure, As the observer's focus lingered on the father's hidden hand, the photograph's initial tranquility began to fracture. The realization settled slowly but firmly that the most important element of the image was not what it revealed, but what it deliberately concealed, and that the father's grip was the only thing preventing that truth from emerging into view. The decision to examine the photograph more closely came not from suspicion, but from discomfort, a lingering sense that the image was withholding something essential. Under magnification, the surface revealed imperfections invisible to the naked eye. Dust embedded in the emulsion, hairline scratches tracing uncertain paths across the scene, and faint chemical stains left by age and improper storage. These marks, once dismissed as decay, began to function like guides, drawing attention toward the lower portion of the frame, where the blanket pooled unnaturally around the father's knee. Digital enhancement clarified what time had blurred. The contrast was gently adjusted, not enough to distort the original tones, but sufficient to deepen shadows and separate overlapping textures. In doing so, the blanket's pattern sharpened, and with it, the suggestion of an object beneath. The fabric did not simply drape, it conformed. Its edges curved around a rigid shape, angular rather than organic, pressing outward in places where the weave thinned from strain. The object's outline resisted interpretation, neither wholly familiar nor easily dismissed as an accidental fold. As the shadows lifted incrementally, a corner emerged, straight and deliberate, breaking the soft geometry of the picnic setting. It sat close to the father's leg, a line parallel to his shin, as though placed there intentionally rather than dropped. The positioning suggested weight, something substantial enough to anchor the blanket despite the uneven ground beneath. Grass around the area lay crushed and flattened in a distinct rectangle, its blades bent sharply rather than brushed aside, indicating prolonged pressure rather than a brief disturbance. Further refinement exposed faint markings along the object's edge. They were shallow but regular, spaced too evenly to be natural. The texture differed from the surrounding elements, absorbing light in a way that implied treated material rather than wood or stone. A narrow indentation ran along one side, just visible where the fabric pulled tightest, hinting at a mechanism or joint concealed beneath layers of cloth and time. Whatever it was, it had form, function, and intention. The father's hand, previously lost to shadow, reappeared in fragments. His fingers curved around something cylindrical, their positioning precise rather than relaxed. The tension noted earlier became undeniable. The muscles of his forearm were engaged, frozen mid-effort by the long exposure. This was not a casual resting place for his hand, but a deliberate hold, maintained with care and awareness. The object was not merely present, it was being controlled. What unsettled the viewer most was the realization that the concealment had been purposeful. The blanket had not shifted accidentally during the photograph. It had been arranged to hide the object while allowing the father to maintain direct contact with it. The image was no longer a passive record, but an act of omission, carefully constructed to present calm, while obscuring something incompatible with the scene's intended narrative. And in that omission, the photograph began to transform from a memory into evidence. The unease stirred by the concealed object prompted a search beyond the photograph itself, an effort to anchor the image within a verifiable moment in time. The landscape offered subtle clues: the slope of the hill, the sparse line of trees in the distance, the particular pattern of fencing barely visible at the edge of the frame. These details, once compared with early land surveys and regional maps, narrowed the location to a rural area that had existed on the margins of a small township in the early 20th century. It was a place largely unchanged in appearance, which made the photograph's setting easier to place, but no less troubling to examine. Local records from that region revealed a brief but unsettling entry dated to the summer of 1908. A child had disappeared from a nearby village. The report, written in clipped, factual language that betrayed neither urgency nor resolution. There were no suspects named, no clear account of events, only the acknowledgement that the child had been last seen walking alone along a road that passed uncomfortably close to the hill where the picnic photograph was taken. The case faded quickly from public attention, as many such cases did at the time, swallowed by limited resources and a reluctance to linger on what could not be easily explained. The date of the disappearance aligned precisely with the estimated age of the photograph. Clothing styles, photographic paper, and chemical composition all pointed to that same narrow window of weeks. This coincidence alone might have been dismissed as unfortunate overlap, were it not for the absence of any other notable events recorded in the area during that period. The photograph and the disappearance stood out as the only preserved moments from an otherwise unremarkable stretch of time, bound together by proximity and timing. Further examination of parish records and local correspondence added an additional layer of discomfort. Mentions of the missing child appeared abruptly, and then ceased entirely, replaced by vague references to communal strain and a desire to restore order. No burial was recorded, no transfer of guardianship, no conclusion offered. It was as if the child's existence had been slowly erased from official memory, leaving behind only that brief acknowledgement of absence. The silence surrounding the outcome was louder than any accusation. When the photograph was reconsidered in light of these findings, its atmosphere shifted dramatically. What had once seemed like an isolated family moment now felt entangled with a broader, unspoken narrative. The picnic's location, so carefully chosen, no longer appeared neutral. The father's downward gaze and tense grip took on new weight, suggesting awareness of something unresolved, something connected to the land beneath them, rather than merely the object concealed at his side. The most unsettling realization was not that the photograph might be linked to the disappearance, but that it had been taken on the very day a search was supposedly underway nearby, capturing a scene of deliberate calm at a moment when the surrounding community was defined by uncertainty and loss, as though the camera had preserved not innocence, but indifference, fixed forever in a frame that refused to acknowledge the child who never returned. The nature of the concealed object remained uncertain until it was compared against artifacts cataloged in early 20th century medical and institutional archives. Once the outline and proportions were isolated, they bore an unsettling resemblance to devices used in private asylums and rest homes during that era, tools designed not for healing but for control. These instruments were often handcrafted, produced by local metalworkers or carpenters, rather than factories, resulting in variations that rarely appeared in official records, yet shared common functional traits. The object beneath the blanket matched those traits too closely to ignore. Such devices were typically employed to restrain patients deemed unmanageable, particularly children whose behavior was frequently labeled pathological rather than understood. Narrow cuffs, reinforced edges, and locking mechanisms allowed caretakers to immobilize limbs discreetly, often beneath clothing or bedding, preserving an outward appearance of normalcy. The faint indentation observed along the object's edge corresponded to a hinge or clasp, while the cylindrical element gripped by the father's hand aligned with the kind of tension rod used to tighten or secure restraints once applied. What made this identification especially disturbing was the context in which such tools were used. Private asylums of the period operated with minimal oversight, relying on the authority of families rather than the state. A child could be committed, restrained, or secluded with little documentation, their treatment justified as necessary discipline or protection. The picnic setting, when viewed through this lens, ceased to be a leisure activity and instead resembled a carefully managed environment, one where containment was prioritized over comfort. The craftsmanship of the object suggested familiarity. It was not something borrowed or improvised for a single occasion, but something maintained, possibly transported regularly. The wear patterns indicated repeated use, subtle smoothing along edges, where fabric would rub during movement. This was not an instrument introduced reluctantly. It was one that had become part of routine, handled often enough to feel natural in the hand that controlled it. The father's grip, tense yet practiced, reflected this familiarity, as though he knew precisely how much pressure to apply. Historical correspondence from the region revealed that private care facilities sometimes allowed families to remove patients temporarily, presenting outings as therapeutic experiments. These excursions were meant to demonstrate progress, to reassure both relatives and observers that restraint and isolation were working. Photographs were occasionally taken during such outings, not as memories, but as proof of compliance, evidence that the patient could exist, however briefly, within a controlled version of normal life. Seen in this context, the picnic photograph took on a chilling clarity. The father's concealed hand was not hiding a weapon, but maintaining a boundary, holding in place something that could not be allowed to disrupt the scene. The blanket served as camouflage, the smiles as reassurance, and the camera as witness, documenting a moment designed to suggest peace, while relying entirely on restraint to sustain it. Closer examination of the mother's expression began as an attempt to find emotional balance within the photograph, a counterweight to the father's visible tension. Her face, at first, appeared calm to the point of emptiness, her lips gently curved, her eyes steady and unfocused in the way common to long exposure portraits. Yet when the tonal values of her features were isolated, something subtle but unmistakable emerged. The highlights around her mouth and cheeks were unnaturally uniform, lacking the natural variation seen elsewhere in the image. This smoothness was not the result of age alone, but of chemical alteration inherent to early photographic processes. In 1908, photographic emulsions were notoriously unstable, especially when exposed to certain environmental conditions. Prolonged exposure to sunlight, combined with residual developing chemicals, could soften facial features, blurring fine lines and muting expressions. This effect often occurred unevenly, yet in the mother's case, it seemed concentrated, as though her face had been selectively preserved in a gentler state. The shadows that should have defined the corners of her mouth and the tension around her eyes were diminished, leaving behind an expression that felt fixed, almost artificial. When compared to other faces in the photograph, the difference was striking. The children's features retained sharper contrast, their expressions readable despite motion blur. The father's face showed clear lines of strain, his jaw set, his eyes intense. Only the mother appeared smoothed into neutrality, her expression hovering between a smile and resignation. This disparity suggested not intention on her part, but a chemical intervention by the medium itself, altering how her emotions were recorded and remembered. Early photographers were aware of these effects and sometimes exploited them. Certain developing techniques were used to soften subjects deemed sensitive or undesirable, particularly women whose expressions might betray distress. By adjusting exposure time or chemical ratios, photographers could produce images that conveyed composure where none truly existed. The mother's face bore the hallmark of such manipulation, not deliberate retouching, but acceptance of distortion in service of appearance. This realization reframed her presence entirely. What had seemed like calm acceptance now read as something closer to suppression. Her posture, rigid and upright, combined with the chemically softened expression, suggested a woman holding herself together under strain, relying on stillness and compliance to endure the moment. The photograph, rather than capturing her true emotional state, had overwritten it, replacing fear or reluctance with an illusion of serenity. In this light, her faint smile became the most unsettling element of the image. It was not evidence of contentment, but a byproduct of a process that erased discomfort for the sake of presentation. The photograph did not merely document her participation. It silenced her response, freezing her into an expression she may never have chosen, and in doing so, revealed how the technology itself colluded in preserving a version of events that concealed suffering beneath the guise of domestic peace. The children, initially overlooked in favor of the more unsettling details surrounding the adults, gradually became impossible to ignore. Their faces, though small within the frame, held an inconsistency that disrupted the photograph's carefully constructed stillness. Early cameras demanded long exposure times, and most subjects learned to remain rigid to avoid blurring. Yet the children's eyes and feet betrayed slight distortions, faint streaks that suggested motion captured against their will. These were not the soft blurs of impatience, but directional, as though their bodies had been shifting away from something rather than toward the camera. The blur around their eyes was particularly revealing. Instead of the uniform softness typical of blinking or restlessness, the distortion pulled sideways, implying a sudden turn of the head mid-exposure. This suggested a moment of distraction or alarm, an instinctive reaction, occurring while the rest of the family remained locked in their roles. Their gazes, once assumed to be directed at the photographer, now appeared unfocused, caught between obedience and impulse. It was as if they had been instructed to sit still, but their attention had been pulled elsewhere. Despite that command, their lower bodies reinforced this impression. The edges of their shoes and hems of their clothing showed slight doubling, a sign that their feet had moved during the exposure. Grass beneath them appeared disturbed, pressed down in uneven patterns that did not align with a simple, seated position. One child's foot seemed angled outward, heel lifted just enough to suggest readiness, not relaxation. This was not the posture of children settled into a picnic, but of children poised to move if given the chance. What made this movement unsettling was its isolation. The adults showed no such blur, no evidence of shifting or hesitation. The father's tension was frozen and deliberate, the mother's posture rigid and composed. Only the children existed in a state of partial motion, caught between stillness and escape. This imbalance hinted at an unspoken rule. They were allowed restlessness, perhaps because their role was less visible, or because their reactions were harder to fully control. Their proximity to one another also took on new meaning. They sat close, shoulders nearly touching, their bodies subtly angled inward. This closeness suggested mutual awareness, a shared unease that required comfort or solidarity. Children often mirror one another's fear, and the photograph seemed to preserve that instinct, even as it tried to suppress it. Their movement was not chaotic, but synchronized in its direction, as though both had responded to the same unseen stimulus. Taken together, these details undermined the image's claim to calm. The children were not participating in a posed moment of leisure. They were reacting to something unfolding just outside the camera's attention. Their blurred motion served as a quiet contradiction to the stillness imposed by the adults, revealing that beneath the photograph's surface, not everyone was willing or able to remain still, and that the truth of the moment was already slipping free despite the long exposure designed to hold it in place. That the photograph might have remained an isolated curiosity, if not for the discovery of a small, leather-bound diary tucked inside a false compartment of the same cedar box. Its cover was worn smooth, the spine cracked from careful, repeated handling, suggesting it had been read often, perhaps in private moments when reassurance was needed. Inside, the handwriting was deliberate and restrained, each line formed with care, as though the writer feared that too much emotion might leak through the ink. The entries were brief, rarely exceeding a paragraph, and focused almost entirely on routine, as if the act of recording normalcy were itself a kind of discipline. Dates were included, though selectively, and when aligned with the estimated timing of the photograph, a troubling pattern emerged. The days leading up to the picnic were marked by heightened attention to appearances. Notes about clothing being cleaned, meals planned with unusual precision, and the weather observed with an anxious eye. The tone shifted subtly, becoming less descriptive and more directive, filled with reminders rather than reflections. The writer seemed intent on ensuring that everything proceeded exactly as intended, leaving little room for deviation. One entry, written on the morning of the picnic, stood apart. It referenced the outing not as a pleasure, but as a necessity. The language suggested obligation rather than anticipation, framing the event as something that had to be done rather than something desired. The phrase used to describe it was careful and telling, referring to the day as a chance to create a final normal memory, a moment that would stand in for many others that could no longer be trusted to occur naturally. The wording carried an awareness of impending change, though it stopped short of explaining what that change would be. There was no mention of the concealed object, nor of restraint or fear, but the absence itself felt intentional. Instead, the writer focused on how the family would appear, emphasizing calm expressions, orderly behavior, and cooperation. The children were mentioned only in terms of compliance, their role defined by how well they followed instructions. Emotion, when it surfaced, was framed as something to be managed rather than expressed, a variable that needed control to preserve the illusion of unity. Entries following the picnic grew shorter, their tone increasingly abstract. The writer spoke of relief without explanation, of order being restored, of the importance of not dwelling on what had passed. The diary did not record joy or grief, only the successful completion of something difficult. The act of writing itself seemed to diminish, as though the need to document had ended once the purpose of the record was fulfilled. In this context, the photograph and the diary became inseparable. The image was not taken to remember a happy day, but to serve as proof that normalcy had been achieved, however briefly. It was a constructed artifact, supported by written intention, meant to endure after memory itself became unreliable. A silent reassurance preserved on paper that everything had once looked exactly as it was supposed to look. The land itself began to draw scrutiny once the photograph and diary were considered together, as though the setting could no longer be treated as a neutral backdrop. Early land registries and parish maps revealed that the picnic site lay on a tract of ground conspicuously absent from formal designation. It had not been marked for agriculture, residence, or public use, existing instead as an undefined space between properties. A place passed over in documentation as if it resisted classification. Such omissions were not uncommon, but they often indicated land with an inconvenient history, Further investigation uncovered references to the area in burial records that predated the photograph by decades. These entries were sparse and irregular, lacking the detailed annotations typically associated with consecrated ground. Names were sometimes replaced with initials, ages omitted, causes of death left blank. The location was referred to obliquely, described only in relation to nearby landmarks, rather than by any official title. This suggested a site used out of necessity, rather than ceremony, a place where the unwanted or unclaimed were laid to rest without drawing attention. Local oral histories, preserved in fragments of correspondence and marginal notes, hinted at long-standing discomfort surrounding the land. It was described as ground that resisted cultivation, where crops failed inexplicably and livestock refused to linger. These accounts, often dismissed as superstition, took on a different weight when aligned with the documentary gaps. The absence of formal recognition appeared less like oversight and more like avoidance, a collective decision to let the land exist without acknowledgement. What made this discovery particularly disturbing was the timeline. Records suggested that the ground had already been used for unmarked burials before 1908, meaning the family's picnic did not transform the site into something ominous. It merely occupied a space already shaped by concealment and neglect. The choice of location, whether intentional or not, aligned the family's private act with a broader pattern of erasure, one that prioritized order and appearance over accountability. The physical characteristics of the land in the photograph reinforced this interpretation. The grass appeared uneven, thinner in patches, with darker soil visible beneath. The ground beneath the blanket looked compacted, as though it had been disturbed repeatedly over time. These details, once purely aesthetic, now suggested a history of use inconsistent with leisure. The earth had been pressed, opened, and closed again long before the family arrived. In this light, the picnic became something other than a momentary intrusion. It read as an extension of the land's purpose, another act of concealment layered atop those that came before. The family did not merely sit upon forgotten ground, they participated in its silence, adding their own carefully curated image to a place defined by what had been hidden. The photograph, when viewed alongside this history, seemed less like a coincidence and more like an alignment, a convergence of private restraint and public omission meeting on land that had long served as a repository for things no one wished to name. If you want, I can continue with key point no, 10 in the same tone and structure, or assemble all key points into a seamless ending section that ties the photograph, land, and truth together. The final understanding of the photograph emerged not from any single discovery, but from the way all the pieces refused to remain separate. The image, the diary, the land, and the missing child converged into a singular realization. The photograph had never been meant for those who took it. It was intended for someone else, someone who would come later, armed with enough distance to see what familiarity had once concealed. The careful composition, the deliberate calm, and the controlled concealment all pointed toward an audience beyond the moment itself. In the early 20th century, photographs were acts of intention. They were expensive, deliberate, and often staged to convey permanence. This image, stripped of names and dates, resisted personal memory while inviting scrutiny. Its anonymity was not accidental. It allowed the photograph to outlive individual accountability, to exist as an artifact unbound by explanation. The absence of identification ensured that when it resurfaced, it would do so as evidence rather than sentiment, demanding interpretation instead of nostalgia. The diary's role clarified this purpose. Its focus on order, completion, and finality suggested a mind preparing for erasure rather than remembrance. The phrase describing the picnic as a final normal memory was not meant to reassure the writer alone. It implied anticipation of a future in which normalcy would be questioned, where proof would be required to assert that things had once appeared intact. The photograph fulfilled that function, offering a visual claim of calm that could be examined when memory itself no longer sufficed. What made the image especially unsettling was its patience. It did not accuse or explain. It waited. Each concealed detail was placed carefully enough to survive time without fully revealing itself, ensuring that only sustained attention would unlock its meaning. The father's grip, the children's movement, the mother's altered expression, and the chosen land all functioned as quiet markers, guiding the observer toward a truth without ever stating it outright. The photograph trusted that someone, eventually, would notice. In this way, the image ceased to be a family record and became a message. It documented not what happened, but what was done to ensure that nothing disrupted the appearance of peace. It preserved a moment when control was prioritized over consequence, when restraint replaced resolution. The camera, indifferent and precise, recorded this choice without judgment, allowing the evidence to persist long after those responsible were gone. The most chilling aspect was not the implication of wrongdoing, but the realization that the photograph had succeeded in its task for over a century. It had passed through hands, archives, and generations without being questioned, its calm accepted at face value. Only when someone looked closely enough did it reveal its true function, not as a memory to be cherished, but as proof designed to surface. When forgetting was no longer possible, the photograph was returned to its box, but it no longer fit there in any meaningful way. Once seen for what it was, it resisted being put away, its presence lingering even when unseen. The calm it portrayed had collapsed entirely, replaced by an understanding that the image had never been passive. It had waited, endured, and outlasted the leaves that depended on its silence, confident that time would eventually strip away the comfort of distance. There was no final revelation carved neatly into record or confession. No name emerged to claim responsibility. No grave could be pointed to with certainty. The truth existed only in fragments, held together by implication and absence. The missing child remained officially unresolved, the land remained undesignated, and the family remained unnamed. Yet the photograph had done what it was meant to do. It had preserved the shape of a lie well enough that, once examined, the lie revealed the truth it tried to conceal. The picnic was never about joy, nor even about memory. It was about control, about holding something in place long enough for order to be declared restored. The father's grip, frozen mid-effort, became the story's final image, a man anchoring a fragile illusion while everything beneath it strained to surface. The children's blurred motion marked the failure of that effort, proof that even in silence, resistance had existed. The mother's softened expression stood as a testament to how easily fear could be erased by process and presentation. In the end, the photograph did not condemn anyone outright. It did something far more unsettling. It demonstrated how easily cruelty could be dressed as normalcy, how restraint could masquerade as care, and how history could be shaped not by what was recorded, but by what was deliberately hidden. The image endured not because it was honest, but because it was convincing. And now, having been seen properly, it no longer needed to speak. Its purpose was complete. What remained was the understanding that countless other images, like it, likely still existed, quiet and unremarkable, waiting in boxes and archives, holding their breath across decades, confident that one day, someone would look closely enough to notice what was being held just out of sight.